The morning of the auction, there were 85 starving sows nobody wanted. They stood in the furthest holding pen of the county livestock exchange, a rusted enclosure that smelled of old ammonia and forgotten things, huddled together in a mass of pale, sunburned skin and protruding ribs. Their heads hung low, their snouts resting against the cracked concrete, and their eyes held the dull, flat look of creatures that had already negotiated their peace with the end. The auctioneer, a man whose voice usually carried the rapid, percussive rhythm of a snare drum, had slowed his cadence to a reluctant drawl when he reached their lot. The local farmers, men with thick forearms and heavy leather boots, leaned against the metal railings and shook their heads, their faces masked in a mixture of pity and economic disdain. These were not animals you bought to build a herd. These were a liability, a drain on feed, 1,000 pounds of impending grief. Alara stood quietly at the back of the crowd, her hands buried deep in the pockets of a canvas jacket that had belonged to her grandfather. She was 28 years old, and she had returned to this valley only 3 weeks prior, carrying nothing but a cardboard box of clothes and the quiet, hollow ache of a life in the city that had simply failed to take root. She watched the sows for a long time, longer than seemed reasonable to the men standing nearby. She watched the way the oldest among them still tried to position her body to shield the weaker ones from the cold wind slicing through the open slats of the barn. She saw the way a rope frays before it breaks, and she recognized something in that fraying that felt intimately familiar. When the auctioneer finally asked for a starting bid, his tone apologetic, a heavy silence fell over the sawdust-covered arena. No one raised a numbered card. No one cleared their throat. It was then that Alara pulled her right hand from her pocket, holding up a small, white square of cardboard. She offered $20 for the entire lot. The gavel fell with a sharp, echoing crack, but the sound was immediately swallowed by a ripple of disbelief that moved through the bleachers. Laughter, sharp and sudden, erupted from the front row. Harlan Caldwell, a man whose vast, aggressively manicured acreage and towering green tractors dominated the county, leaned back in his seat and slapped his knee. He was the established voice of modern agriculture in the valley, a man who believed that the earth was a factory floor and that yield was simply a matter of applying enough chemical force. "Well, I'll be damned," Harlan boomed, his voice carrying effortlessly across the arena. Little Alara comes back from the big city and decides to open a hospice for hogs. You just bought yourself 85 funerals, sweetheart. You're gonna spend more burying them than you paid for them. That $20 is just a down payment on a whole lot of heartbreak. He had meant it as a prediction of failure. It would turn out to be a prediction of something else entirely. Before we go further into what happened out on that forgotten piece of land, I want to ask you to tap the like button if you appreciate stories of quiet resilience. And please leave a comment telling me the name of the town or city you are watching from. I ask this because I read every single one, and I like knowing where these stories travel. Alara did not flush, nor did she look down. She met Harlan's gaze with a level, unblinking stare that carried no heat and no defensiveness. She simply folded her numbered card, slipped it back into her jacket, and walked toward the loading docks to claim her purchase. The drive back to the old family farm was a slow, agonizing procession. She had hired a local hauler, a quiet man who charged her a fraction of his usual rate out of a silent, unspoken sympathy. The truck crawled along the winding county roads, the tires humming a low, mournful tune against the asphalt. Alara followed behind in her grandfather's rusted pickup, the steering wheel vibrating violently in her hands. The landscape shifted as they drove, the neat, laser-leveled fields of the Caldwell estate giving way to the rolling, timbered foothills where the soil grew thinner and the shadows grew longer. This was where Alara had been born, and this was where she had fled from, chasing the bright, electric promise of a city that had ultimately chewed her up and spat her out with a quiet, devastating indifference. She had worked in a gray cubicle, pushing digital numbers across glowing screens, watching years evaporate in a haze of fluorescent lighting and meaningless deadlines, until the letter arrived informing her of her grandfather's passing and the neglected acreage that was now hers. The farm was known locally as the Old Miller Place, though it had not been a working farm in any real sense for over a decade. When Alara turned her truck down the long, rutted driveway, the headlights cut through the gathering dusk to reveal a portrait of deep, undisturbed decay. The porch of the farmhouse sagged like a broken jaw, the floorboards warped and soft with rot. The massive timber frame barn leaned heavily to the east, as if exhausted by the simple act of standing upright against the wind. The pastures, once a patchwork of clover and native grasses, were now a wild, impenetrable tangle of briars, thistle, and woody scrub. It was a burden, a monument to the slow, relentless reclamation of nature. But as Alara stepped out of the truck and smelled the damp earth and the sharp scent of pine needles, she did not feel the urge to run. Instead, something in her had settled. The frantic, scattering energy of her city life fell away, replaced by a heavy, quiet gravity. The hauler backed his trailer up to the old, splintering loading chute. The 85 sows stumbled out, their hooves clicking weakly against the wood. They moved like ghosts, pale and insubstantial in the fading light. Alara guided them into the lower pasture, a sunken, bowl-shaped depression of land that was heavily overgrown with wild blackberry bushes and shaded by ancient, twisting oak trees. She hauled water in heavy 5-gallon buckets, her shoulders burning, and scattered what little feed she had been able to purchase. The sows ate slowly, exhaustedly, and then collapsed into the tall grass, becoming indistinguishable from the shadows. That night, Alara walked through the dark, silent rooms of the farmhouse. The air smelled of old paper, dust, and the faint, sweet scent of pipe tobacco that seemed permanently woven into the wallpaper. She made her way to her grandfather's study, a small room at the back of the house that had always been off-limits during her childhood. The room was dominated by a massive, scarred oak desk. Upon it sat a small brass oil lamp and a stack of heavy, leather-bound ledgers. Alara struck a match, lit the lamp, and pulled the first ledger toward her. She opened it, expecting to find the dry, numerical accounting of a struggling farm, columns of expenses, crop yields, and debt. Instead, she found something that read like the field notes of a man studying something he loved with a fierce, almost religious devotion. The pages were filled with her grandfather's cramped, meticulous handwriting. There were sketches of root systems, detailed observations of weather patterns dating back 40 years, and long philosophical meditations on the nature of soil. She read through the night, the yellow light of the lamp flickering against the dark window panes. Her grandfather had not been a conventional farmer. He had viewed the forceful, chemical-heavy methods of men like Harlan Caldwell with a quiet, tragic sorrow. He wrote about the land not as a resource to be extracted, but as a living, breathing entity with a long memory. One phrase, underlined thrice in dark blue ink, appeared again and again across the decades of journals. The ground remembers. Patience beats money, and attention beats force. Debt is a man telling the future what it has to do. As dawn broke, painting the eastern sky in bruised shades of purple and gold, Alara found an entry dated exactly 85 years prior, written by her great-grandfather and transcribed by her grandfather. It detailed a catastrophic spring flood that had swept through the valley, washing away outbuildings and reshaping the very topography of the lower pasture. The entry mentioned the loss of the original stone smokehouse, a massive subterranean structure built into the hillside, buried completely under tons of mud and debris. The final line of the entry read, "The earth took it back, but the salt and the stone remain. Let the pigs root where the ground dips. They know where the water sleeps." Alara closed the ledger. Her eyes were burning with exhaustion, but her mind was fiercely, brilliantly awake. She understood now that she possessed no money, no modern equipment, and no standing in the community. But she possessed an inheritance of profound, generational attention. She made a pot of black coffee and walked out to the front porch to watch the sun rise over the ruined pastures. Later that morning, Alara drove into town to visit her great-aunt Martha, the last living elder of the Miller family. Martha was 92 years old, a woman carved from hardwood and wire, who lived in a small, impeccably neat house on the edge of the county line. She wore practical men's trousers and a faded flannel shirt, and she possessed a gaze that could strip the bark off a tree. When Alara sat at her small kitchen table and explained the purchase of the 85 starving sows, expecting a lecture on financial ruin, Martha simply poured a cup of scalding black tea and pushed it across the table. "Harlan Caldwell is a fool who thinks he can argue with the weather," Martha said, her voice a dry, papery rasp. "He bought his farm with borrowed money, and he runs it with borrowed time. Your grandfather knew better. Those sows you bought, they are at the end of their rope. But a starving animal has a memory for survival that a fat animal has forgotten. You put them in the lower pasture." "Yes," Alara said, "where the ground dips." Martha nodded once, a sharp, decisive motion. "Good. Do not feed them from a trough. Scatter the grain deep in the brush. Make them work. Make them remember they are pigs. And when they start digging, let them dig. The old smokehouse is down there. Your grandfather always said the soil above it was the richest on the continent, cured by 80 years of hickory ash and salt. Let the animals do the work the tractors cannot." Alara returned to the farm and began the slow, unglamorous work that would define her life for the next year. It was work that was entirely invisible to anyone who was not paying close attention. She did not buy expensive fencing. She spent weeks walking the perimeter of the lower pasture, meticulously mending the old, rusted barbed wire by hand, stretching it taut with a come-along winch and pounding new cedar posts into the earth with a heavy iron maul. Her hands blistered, bled, and eventually grew thick, hard calluses. Her shoulders broadened, and the hollow, haunted look of the city vanished from her face, replaced by a deep, wind-burned tan. She followed her great-aunt's advice and her grandfather's ledgers to the letter. She did not pour feed into concrete troughs. Instead, she took her meager rations of grain and scattered them deep into the impenetrable thickets of blackberry, thistle, and overgrown brush in the lower pasture. At first, the 85 sows were too weak to do much more than glean what lay on the surface. But as the days turned into weeks, a primal, dormant instinct began to awaken within them. Driven by the scent of the scattered grain and a deep, cellular need for minerals, they began to root. They used their strong snouts as plows, tearing into the dense, matted root systems of the invasive brush. They turned the soil with a relentless, mechanical efficiency, aerating the compacted earth and manuring it as they went. Alara watched them daily, standing quietly by the fence line with her grandfather's notebook in hand, recording their movements, noting which plants they devoured and which they ignored. She was practicing rotational grazing, moving them in tight, controlled patterns across the depression of the lower pasture, allowing the land behind them to rest and recover. Down at the local feed store, Elias Pratt's place, the county's true circulatory system for gossip, Alara's operation was a source of constant amusement. The store smelled heavily of sweet molasses, cracked corn, and old motor oil. Harlan Caldwell and his lieutenants, men who drove trucks that cost more than Alara's entire farm, would lean against the counter, drinking bitter coffee and holding court. Whenever Alara came in to buy her small, carefully budgeted sacks of grain, the room would fall into a hushed, theatrical silence, followed by a chorus of false friendliness. "Morning, Alara," Harlan would say, tipping his immaculate white hat back on his head. "How's the archaeology project coming along? Those walking skeletons of yours managed to stand up straight today? Or are you still propping them up with sticks? I hear you're running a fitness camp for swine." Alara would place her money on the counter, look Harlan dead in the eye, and answer plainly, without a trace of heat or defensiveness. "They are eating. They are finding what they need." Her level, non-reactive tone always took the fun out of the question, leaving the mockers in an awkward, hollow silence. It was like trying to punch a body of water. There was no resistance, only a calm surface that immediately reformed. Elias Pratt, a quiet old-timer who had known her grandfather, would silently ring up her purchase. He never joined in the mocking. Once, as he handed her the receipt, he caught her eye and offered a small, nearly imperceptible nod, a private confirmation that he remembered a time when her grandfather was laughed at for the exact same methods. By the middle of the summer, a profound transformation was occurring in the lower pasture. The 85 sows were no longer starving. They had gained weight, their skin turning a healthy, vibrant pink beneath a thick coating of protective mud. Their ribs vanished beneath layers of solid muscle and fat. But more importantly, their relentless rooting had fundamentally altered the landscape. They had cleared acres of choking brush, turning the soil over and exposing the rich, dark earth beneath. It was in late August, during a week of sweltering heat, that Alara heard the sound. She was sitting on the sagging porch, mending a leather halter, when a sharp metallic clink echoed up from the lower pasture, followed by the dull, heavy thud of stone scraping against stone. She set down her tools and walked down the hill. In the deepest part of the depression, a group of the oldest sows had rooted down nearly 4 feet into the side of an embankment. They were grunting excitedly, their snouts covered in a strange, grayish-black soil. Alara climbed down into the excavation. She knelt in the dirt and brushed away the loose earth with her bare hands. Beneath her fingers, she felt the cold, rough surface of cut stone. It was a massive, hand-hewn block. She kept digging, her heart hammering a steady rhythm against her ribs. She uncovered another block, and then another, forming a perfect curving arch. The sows had found it. They had unearthed the roof of the lost smokehouse, buried 85 years ago. Alara spent the next 3 days carefully excavating the site alongside the pigs. As she cleared the earth, the sheer scale of the structure revealed itself. It was a subterranean cavern of stone, built deep into the hillside. But it was what lay inside that was truly miraculous. The mudslide that had buried the smokehouse had sealed it perfectly. Decades of hickory ash, saltpeter, and curing spices had leached into the surrounding soil, creating a massive, concentrated pocket of minerals. Furthermore, the thick stone foundation had acted as a subterranean dam, capturing and holding the water from an underground spring that had been slowly trickling through the bedrock for nearly a century. The soil here was cool, damp, and impossibly rich, a hidden oasis beneath the dry crust of the summer earth. The sows devoured the mineral-rich earth with a frantic joy, absorbing the salts and nutrients their bodies had been starved of for so long. They wallowed in the cool, damp mud created by the trapped spring, protecting their skin from the sun and insects. Alara noted the change in her grandfather's ledger without ceremony, but she allowed herself a long moment to sit on the edge of the stone foundation, her boots dangling over the cool earth, and simply breathe. She was witnessing the slow, majestic unlocking of the land's memory. The winter came and went, a mild season of gray skies and cold rain. In the spring, the true miracle of Alara's slow work manifested. The 85 sows, once considered walking corpses, delivered massive, thriving litters of piglets. They farrowed out in the open, building deep, warm nests in the tall native grasses that had miraculously sprung up in the wake of the cleared brush. The soil, deeply aerated by the pigs and fertilized by their manure, absorbed the spring rains like a massive sponge, holding the moisture deep within its structure rather than letting it run off into the creeks. And then the great crisis arrived. It began in June, a subtle shift in the wind that brought dry, baking air from the west. The rain simply stopped. By July, the county was in the grip of the worst drought in living memory. The sky turned a pale, punishing white, and the sun beat down on the valley like a hammer on an anvil. The creeks shrank to muddy puddles and then to cracked, baked clay. For the conventional farmers like Harlan Caldwell, the drought was a catastrophe of biblical proportions. Harlan's vast fields, engineered for maximum yield through chemical fertilizers and shallow tilling, had no resilience. The soil, stripped of its organic matter and compacted by heavy machinery, turned to fine dust that blew away in the hot wind. His shallow-rooted crops withered and died in the span of a few weeks. His massive confinement barns, reliant on electrical cooling and pumped water, became suffocating ovens. Without natural forage or shade, his livestock suffered terribly, forcing him to haul in expensive water and feed on credit, pushing his heavily leveraged operation to the brink of collapse. The feed store became a place of grim, silent men, their faces etched with the terrifying arithmetic of impending ruin. But down on the old Miller place, a different reality existed. Alara's farm remained an impossible, vibrant green island in a county that had turned entirely brown. The native grasses in her lower pasture, their roots driven deep into the earth by the rotational grazing, tapped into the moisture held deep in the soil profile. The ancient stone foundation of the unearthed smokehouse continued to pool the cool, subterranean spring water, creating a lush, shaded wetland where the pigs thrived. The 85 sows, now massive and powerful, moved through the tall green forage with their litters, healthy, hydrated, and entirely unaffected by the searing heat above. Ilara's methods, dismissed as foolishness, had created an ecosystem capable of absorbing a shock that shattered the conventional systems. She had not forced the land to perform. She had healed its capacity to endure. The vindication did not come with a loud announcement. It came quietly, through the dusty windshields of pickup trucks that began to slow down as they passed her property line. People drove out from town just to look. They parked on the shoulder of the county road, leaning over their steering wheels, staring at the impossible green of Ilara's pastures and the fat, healthy animals moving through them. They looked at their own dying fields, and then they looked at hers, and in that silent comparison, a paradigm shifted. The mockery that had once filled the feed store evaporated, replaced by a stunned, calculating silence. They finally understood what they were looking at all along. One evening in late August, when the heat of the day had finally broken, Ilara was down by the old smokehouse foundation, checking the water levels. She heard the crunch of heavy tires on her gravel driveway. She walked up the hill and saw Harlan Caldwell's massive green truck parked near the sagging porch. Harlan was standing by the fence line, staring out over the lower pasture. He looked 10 years older than he had at the auction. His face was drawn, his shoulders slumped, and the immaculate white hat was held loosely in his hands, resting against his belt. Ilara approached him quietly, stopping a few feet away. She did not speak. She simply waited, allowing the silence to stretch between them, filled only by the sound of the wind moving through the tall grass. Harlan did not look at her at first. He kept his eyes fixed on a massive sow nursing a dozen fat piglets in the shade of an oak tree. When he finally turned to Ilara, his eyes were red-rimmed and exhausted. He did not offer an excuse, and he did not attempt to dress up his defeat with false pride. He was a man stripped down to the bare, uncomfortable truth. "I am hauling half my herd to the auction tomorrow," Harlan said, his voice stripped of its usual booming resonance. "Selling them for pennies on the dollar because I can't afford the water to keep them alive. The bank is calling me every morning. My topsoil is currently blowing somewhere over the next county." He paused, swallowing hard, his fingers tightening around the brim of his hat. "I was wrong," he said, stating it plainly, not as praise, but as a kind of grievance against the order of things. "Everything I thought I knew about how this works, everything I put my faith in, it broke when the pressure hit. And you bought a graveyard and turned it into an oasis. I don't understand how you did it, but I need to know. If you are willing to tell me." Ilara looked at him, seeing not the arrogant man who had mocked her, but a neighbor who was drowning. She remembered her grandfather's notes on patience, on how a rigid thing will always snap while a flexible thing will bend and survive. She did not gloat. She did not remind him of his words at the auction. "That's one approach," Ilara said softly, gesturing toward his truck. "But it requires fighting the land every step of the way. Come down to the lower pasture, Mr. Caldwell. Let me show you what the pigs found." That walk down the hill was the beginning of a ripple effect that would slowly transform the valley. Harlan Caldwell's conversion did what Ilara's own success alone could not. When the loudest, most established voice in the county admitted his error and began quietly adopting her methods, the rest of the community followed. The skepticism dissolved into a desperate, eager curiosity. Other farmers began to visit Oakhaven, parking their trucks in the yard and walking the fields with Ilara. She became a teacher, sharing the knowledge from her grandfather's ledgers freely. She showed them how to read the grass, how to rest the soil, and how to understand that water is a currency that must be banked in the earth, not drained away. Not long after, a serious, quiet local teenager named Thomas began riding his bicycle out to the farm after school. He didn't ask for a job. He simply picked up a shovel one afternoon and started helping Alara muck out a winter shelter. He had the hands for the work, patient, steady, and observant. Alara began paying him a fair wage, but more importantly, she began teaching him. She showed him the ledgers, explaining the slow, ancestral wisdom of the land. In Thomas, she saw the successful transmission of the legacy to a new generation, ensuring that the knowledge would not be buried again. As the farm's reputation grew, Alara's products, the meat from the hogs raised on wild forage and ancient minerals, became highly sought after. Chefs from the city she had fled began calling, offering premium prices. A name for the enterprise emerged organically among the locals, the Smokehouse Sows. But faced with sudden demand, Alara refused to take on debt to expand rapidly. She grew only the way the land could grow, letting the natural carrying capacity of the soil dictate her herd size. She remained financially prudent, remembering her grandfather's warning that debt was a man telling the future what it had to do. She chose quiet confidence over rapid scale. In the late autumn of that year, Great-Aunt Martha passed away peacefully in her sleep. Alara had visited her the day before, bringing a basket of cured ham and late-season apples. Martha had sat in her rocking chair, looking out her window toward the distant ridge of Oakhaven. She had taken Alara's calloused hand in her own frail, papery fingers, tracing the thick skin with a quiet reverence. "You listened," Martha had whispered, her eyes bright and sharp to the very end. "You let the ground remember. Your grandfather is resting easy now. You did good, child." Her death was a profound loss, a bittersweet closing of a generational loop. It marked the final transfer of the mantle. Alara was no longer the returning outsider. She was now the keeper of the knowledge, the new wise elder in a community that had learned to respect the slow, unglamorous truth of her work. The story comes full circle 3 years later, on a crisp, bright morning in October. Alara stood once again at the county livestock exchange. The air smelled of cold dust and animal heat. She was there to purchase a small flock of neglected sheep to begin clearing a new section of upper pasture. She wore her grandfather's canvas jacket, its pockets worn soft by time and use. When the auctioneer brought the ragged flock into the ring, he did not rush, and he did not sound apologetic. He looked directly at Alara. She raised her numbered card, offering a price that was fair but remarkably low. This time, no one in the bleachers laughed. Harlan Caldwell, standing in the front row, simply nodded his head in silent respect. The other farmers watched with keen interest, knowing that whatever Alara saw in those rejected animals was something they had yet to learn how to see. The gavel fell with a sharp crack, sealing the purchase. It is a simple truth, written in the ledgers of old men and proven in the deep, restored soils of neglected farms. That the rejected thing is the valuable thing when you know how to read it. That patience beats money, and attention beats force. That worth does not need to argue because in the end, it simply proves itself. I want to thank you for listening to this story. If it resonated with you, please share it with someone who might feel like they are not worth much right now. Someone who needs to know that their value isn't determined by the loudest voice in the room. And please, tell me about the thing in your own life that everybody laughed at. The small, stubborn thing you kept on with anyway. Leave it in the comments below. I read every comment. Every one. I will read yours.